New Yorkers. Finally, with concerns growing, the city began contingency planning and preparatory work for that aqueduct repair in 2004, but significant for current purposes until the problem reached almost a crisis pitch in terms of planning. Very little had been done. The final issue confronting the city's supply in the future is that of purity, and it provides a final example of the role of politics in crisis-oriented decision-making. Historically, drinking water from the city's upstate reservoirs has been high in quality and has consistently met state and federal health standards. But post-World War II, suburban development changed the lay of the land. Shopping centers were developed, tract housing was built, new superhighways cropped up, including Interstate 684, which was precariously laid right next to the Kensico Reservoir with little thought given to the long-term consequences. And the Kensico Reservoir, again, unseen on this portion of the map, is the final switching station for all 6 of these giant reservoirs. 90% of the city's water flows through it, and in the 1990s, city and state officials were asleep at the switch when the state transportation department proposed to lay a interstate highway immediately adjacent to that critical water resource. For decades, city officials looked the other way and ignored warning signs as some measures of reservoir or stream water quality began to slip as a result of this suburbanization. Then in 1986, Congress passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, and EPA, in compliance with that statute, said all surface water supplies in the United States need to be filtered. New York City's water supply isn't filtered. That's a story for another day. But because the city hadn't acted forcefully to address pollution threats for the 3 or 4 decades preceding, it now had to move swiftly. In 1992, the city published aggressive new rules to regulate land use controls and pollution in the upstate watershed regions under Commissioner Appleton and Mayor Dinklage. The upstate residents in that community reacted angrily and swiftly, and they sued. And by the way, tensions had been great between the upstate communities and New York City almost since the very beginnings of these water reservoirs being built. The way in which they were built had a profound effect on relations between upstate. To make way for the Ashokan Reservoir, for the example, 7 villages were submerged, nearly 2,000 residents resettled, 2,800 bodies reinterred. And this pattern was repeated to a similar degree with respect to all of the upstate reservoirs, and that's part of the reason these contentious beginnings, why relations between upstate and downstate have been rough until this day. So here we are in the 1990s, upstate residents challenging new city rules to prevent pollution in the watershed. There was a political deadlock. EPA was getting anxious and was on the verge of ordering New York City to filter its water supply at an estimated cost then of $5 or $6 billion. Today it would be about $10 billion. Again, crisis facing the New York City water supply. Governor Pataki then brokered a landmark 1997 watershed agreement between upstate interests, downstate interests, New York City and New York State. It had many good elements. It provided $1.5 billion for watershed protection and partnership programs. It began a land acquisition program that today is close to 100,000 acres of the 1 million acre watershed protected, but it was unquestionably a political document with political compromises necessary to get agreement among the parties. And the negotiations took place in a supercharged political atmosphere. This historic agreement solved the immediate crisis and was certainly a step forward, but it didn't put in place a new comprehensive watershed protection regime with a 30 or 50-year lens to safeguard this priceless and irreplaceable resource. Maybe it's unrealistic in these days to think, as LaGuardia said, that chief executives must be looking 50 or 75 years down the line if they're going to do their job. But that is the challenge that we confront. So, looking into the future, the city faces some daunting challenge to protect this upstate water supply. Sprawl and haphazard development, Las Vegas-style casinos that will completely change the rural landscape, industrial gas drilling, the #1 pollution threat right now. You've heard a lot about it. It's being proposed by the governor. It's the nuttiest idea to come along in many with respect to the long-term preservation of the city water supply and of New York City as a viable city in which to live and do business. And climate change, we'll hear about that a little more too. But it'll have big impacts, not only on the airports and other things, but on the reservoirs. There'll be greater water usage, there'll be increased evaporation, there'll be disruptive patterns of precipitation that could adversely impact the amount of water that makes it into reservoirs. So, indeed, considering all of these challenges and problems we faced and the role of politics and the short-term crisis-oriented nature of our solutions, it's amazing that the system is really as good as it is. But we've coasted for a long time. We've taken advantage of the benefits that the folks who designed the system early on have given us. They had a 100-year time horizon in mind when they built the system. And now, although much of the city's water supply has involved a continuing search for new sources of pure water, politics, economics, logistics, and other considerations make major new additions to the city water supply unlikely. So the battle in the 21st century will be to maintain the system's infrastructure, to conserve water, and to protect the quality of existing resources. This will be the city's preeminent water supply mission in the coming decades, and whether we succeed or not will be determined in large part by the ability of the public to express its concerns, to get these issues before elected officials, and to engage in the political process before the crises come. And if we could get our elected officials to live for 200 years, not to stay in office for 200 years, but to live for 200 years so they could see the long-term impacts of the decisions, we'd all be better off. Thank you for your attention.